there. It's another DJ Shan Azure Remix show. I am joined once again by Matt Canty. How are you today, Matt?
Not too bad. How about you, Shannon?
I am doing well, doing well. Although it is going into the winter months, which aren't my favorite usually, but I'm still doing well. Trying to find the positive, right?
Right. Well, so far no snow here, so
Yeah, it's been cold enough to snow, a little bit of light flurries, but nothing's stuck just yet. So very, very similar weather patterns. But anyway, so if you've been paying attention, we've sort of walked you through a lot of different features of ARM templates, right? And I think to sort of cap it off, I wanted to showcase something that I leaned on Matt for help. So when I joined my previous team, I saw that there was a need to plug in an ARM template for replica domain controllers. So our quick starts presuppose that everybody is going to build out a brand new domain in a forest. And granted, tweaking that isn't difficult. So I think that's why it is largely just stuck as a brand new forest and domain. But I thought, wouldn't it be cooler for the folks that are trying to figure out ARM templates if it was sort of ready to go? So I went down this path and I got some buy-in from folks that are managing the IT Ops Talk blog to write a couple of blog posts about ARM templates, how to build things out, how to think through a Dsc extension, troubleshoot that extension, et cetera, et cetera. And I, of course, got stuck. So who did I call? Matt Canty. Do you remember why I called you? I was getting all kinds of weird errors, and what we had determined was I was passing my passwords in as clear text, and that was a fun moment. So I wanted to start by showing where this lives on GitHub. So it's my first initial, my middle initial, and my last name, whack replica DCs, and it's a public repo. Basically, the template already assumes you've got your on-prem network connected to a gateway subnet. So that does not show up in this ARM template. Those are the prereqs, so to speak, and that you also need to set the DNS so that these servers know how to resolve themselves, know where the domain is, etc. These are the blog posts that I authored. So introduction to building the replica domain controller template, the prereqs, design considerations, digging into the code, desired state configuration extension, and then the replica domain controller ARM template, and then how to troubleshoot. I think we talked a little bit about that, and I can showcase some of how that shows up on an existing environment. But yeah, this kind of walks you through it, right? Like some of the benefits, some of the challenges. Most of the customers I work with build this type of environment versus standing up a brand new forest and domain, or standing up Azure Active Directory domain services. So I will link to this in the show notes.
So your customers don't spin up their new domain contoso.com in the cloud all the time?
No, they don't.
That is a frustrating thing about some of the stuff that we go
I
through.
know. And
we look at our documentation that says, oh yeah, Contoso or Fabricam or something like that, and somebody's
right,
like, that's right. How do I do something new, but how do I do it in my existing environment? So
exactly.
That's what this template. I love this template for that.
Yeah. So so I still have everything living in Visual Studio. So my apologies for not moving it to Visual Studio Code. I've always feel like there's not enough time in the day to do everything we want to do, and it still functionally works the same way. It's just, you know, it's got the deploy Azure resource group PowerShell already in there, and then when you right click and you hit deploy, it will call upon that PowerShell script and it will pass everything through. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the parameters or the variables. They are important. I wanted to spend some time and talk through the resources that get deployed. So when Matt first helped me out, he was like, wait, you're deploying 2 servers. I said, yeah. And he said, are they basically like the same server? I said, yeah. And he said, you know what? You should think about doing this a little bit differently. And that's when he introduced me to the concept of copy index and pad left. So Matt, do you want to kind of walk our viewers through that? I feel like you've got a better way of describing it. I'd probably fumble through the description.
Yeah, so basically what happened was the ARM team decided, hey, you know, with infrastructure as code, we should probably have a way to do these things that developers do, like looping, right? And so your concept of copy within the ARM template is like doing a for each type of loop, or a
Okay.
for with a number, right? So you have on line 137 there, you have a copy keyword that basically tells, you know, when the template execution engine sees that, it says, oh, okay, we're going to be doing a loop here, and we're gonna do this same resource this many times. So that's the count. And then you can give it a nice little name of, hey, you know, this is, in this case, we're creating nicks, so it's a nick loop. Now, the problem that you run into when you're doing a loop is, hey, you know, I need to access resources from within this loop, you know, maybe one at a time, right? And so therefore you have this what's called the copy index, which is basically, it means it's a function that says this is the point in which we are at during this copy loop, right? So copy index for the first run of creating this nick would be 1 or 0. It's a 0 based
Okay.
loop, right? So then, you know, in once it creates that machine is the first machine, and then the copy index switches to the second one now, which would be 1 in a 0-based array, right? And so what the copy index allows us to do is say, like, if we're naming our nicks here, you can see there's a function in there that we used called pad left. It's part of the name up on line 133. When we name this, we're concatenating a couple things: the name of our nick, first of all, and then the copy index of that. But then what pad left is doing is giving a little bit of kind of uniformity in case we are, you know, like, so you don't get VM 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You'd get VM 001, VM 002, and then VM 010 for VM 10, right? So we're just so that pad left is just adding some padding into the number part of that name.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and so basically that's what we're doing, is we're using a copy loop, and we have to use a copy index to reference the current iteration of the loop that we're in.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the nick. The nick comes on first, so it's not depending on anything. The availability set is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. You can check out the code when you're interested to take a look. It's a little bit deeper. This is where we start to need the depends on components, right? So we're naming it very similarly. We're taking the DC prefix, we're padding left, right? We're making sure that that's like sequentially like 01, 02, etc. The copy here is specified. So the resource count up above is 2. That's what deploys. You can always change that. If you have a bigger environment, you want to make sure you've got multiple Replica domain controllers outside of 2, right? You want 2 and beyond. It's up to you on how you want to scale this. Then the name here is VM loop. So it's depending on the nick loop. So this won't start until these finish, which was a fun reality to sort of specify.
Yeah, and another thing that you'll notice too is that we're using the same count parameter for the nick loop as we are for the VM loop, right? Because we don't need more or less nicks than we have VMs, right? We're creating one for each, one nick for each VM. So we're using that same parameter. So this is the number of resources we need, and the resources that go together like a nick and a VM rely on that same count. So that way, you know, you don't have to specify multiple you know, parameters, or worry about one being off from the other one. They're just using the same one. So we're saying we need 2 resources. We're going to create 2 nicks and 2 VMs.
Yeah. And notice down here, as you keep going down, you see another thing, right? We're concatenating the DC prefix. We're padding left, right? So we are doing the same thing with the computer name, which you saw up here, but we're providing it for the OS profile. We're providing it for the OS disk. So notice how this disk is concatenating quite a bit. So the DC prefix, it's padding left, right? And then it's adding a variable, which is the OS disk name. And so that's because I want to specify exactly how this resource is named. And so I pulled this in as a variable. I feel like that's the thing that would probably change for folks. So I kind of guessed that it would probably be a variable. Sorry, a variable. Or sorry, I guess we should. I got all tripped up. The idea of the variable would be that it wouldn't change. And my thinking was it wasn't going to change, whereas your computer name or your DC prefix would probably change. So that's why it's a variable versus a parameter.
Yeah, and it could be some parameters being thrown together as a variable and just
Correct.
easier to reference that way.
Like we had done with some of the nested template deployments.
Exactly.
And then same thing down here, the data disk, the name is doing the same thing, and then it's pulling in the variable of the data disk name.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of
cool. The important part, which is the NIC, right? We got to attach this VM to a NIC, and that NIC is being created in the NIC loop, right?
Correct. Yes. And it is pulling in. So the ID, it's pulling the ID in.
Yep. It's looking for network interfaces within the same resource group, right? Because if you look at that resource ID function, if you don't provide a resource group name at the front of that function, then it's going to look within the same resource group, right?
Yep.
So within the same resource group, it's going to look for a resource type of network interfaces where
the variable has been, so it's DC nickname.
Yep, DC nickname and pad left, just like we did up at the top to name the NIC. We're using that same concatenation string here to find that same NIC at the same copy index of where the virtual machine is. So if you look at this, one of the things that might be confusing is that copy index in there is saying, oh, this is the copy index for the VM loop. So it's going to look for a NIC that has a name that was copied at the same index of the NIC loop. So if we're on VM number 1 here, then it's going to look for the NIC that was named, 1, right? Because that's what our current copy index is. And, if we were on VM number 5, it would look for the same NIC, right? The NIC that was named during the NIC loop iteration number 5, which should be, nickname, pad left, copy index, and then how many zeros and stuff like that you're at.
So then I wanted to showcase the actual DSC extension. So similarly to the NIC and the DCs themselves, we're doing the pad left copy index bit. We're also passing in the extension name.
Yep.
And the extension name we're also pad lefting and copy indexing.
Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no, it's okay.
One thing I would want to point out to the viewers is that if you're looking at these functions that we're using, like pad left or copy index or etc., those actually are well documented and they can be found in the documentation. I think we pointed this documentation out a few episodes ago for the functions, but we could even include it.
I think that's going to be a good one to call out because folks might watch this one out of order. And I feel like putting the pad left copy index bit in here is going to make sense, as well as some of the DSC documentation, because I feel like that's going to also make sense, as well as where this lives in GitHub. So that way you could star it, fork it, whatever you want to do in terms of grabbing that code.
Yeah, because you'll see here, look at like line 244 for just as an example. This is a chain together set of functions, right? We start out with the concat function, and so then you have whatever you're providing to the concat function, right? Which would be things that you want to concat together, and they're comma separated, right? So if we want to concat this parameter with something else, so we're putting that parameter in, then we're doing another function, right, to pad left, and we're adding. And then that add is another function, and then we have copy index within there, right? So we've just chained together 3 or 4 different functions, and so reading through that documentation, you'll be able to determine what parameters those functions take, like what logically goes in here, because it doesn't make sense, especially when you're chaining together a bunch of functions and using a function inside of a function inside of a function. You might start getting confused about what comma is separating what, or what parenthesis is separating what, and where one thing ends and one thing begins. So the documentation is a good place to figure that stuff out.
Well, and the beauty is if you screw something up, it won't run, and it'll sort of tell you where you need to go and what you need to adjust and fix. And let's say you adjust and you fix it, but you don't like the way it looks. Well, you can just delete what you've done and redeploy, right? So there's some flexibility here as you think through your deployments.
Yeah, for the most part, it's pretty good about telling you where you've gone wrong, but there might be cases where you're manipulating a string like a name or something like that where it will run, but you'll get something that you don't expect, right?
Yeah.
So if you put a 2 in the wrong spot, right, your VM name now might be VM copy
202. Yeah.
2, whatever, right? So
Right.
yeah, just be aware of stuff like that too. When you're manipulating strings, it doesn't always error out nicely, and it might actually come back and you'll see it logically versus runtime errors.
Yeah. This also depends upon the VM loop. So this won't even run until the servers are up and functional. So another depends on call out, which I thought was kind of cool to showcase. This is the next piece I wanted to showcase, the actual DSC properties, right? So
Yep.
you've got your publisher, which we talked about the last time.
Another thing we might want to mention as well is that copy loop, the VM loop itself, that's actually going to run in somewhat parallel, right? It's not going to wait for VM0 to finish running before it runs VM1 and then wait for that to finish before it runs VM2, right? So if you have 10 VMs and you do a copy loop, as long as those things don't depend on each other, then those things are going to be kicked off right away, right? So you've got whatever your provision time is in maybe a few seconds in between when the first one gets started and the last one gets started. So it's not keeping it in serial either.
Yeah.
What keeps things in serial is this depends on, and that's where it becomes both important and handy, because the importance of that is if I try to run an extension on a VM that doesn't exist, well, there's nothing to run it on, and that deployment just tried to happen and failed, and that's not going to run then when it's time to run because it already failed because the VM wasn't there, right? Same thing with creating a VM. You can't create a VM if the NIC's not there, so it would try to create the VM and the NIC at the same time, and it'd say, oh, the NIC's not there, fail. And in this case, it says, oh, I noticed that we have a dependency chain. Now, where this really comes in handy is when you're deploying workloads, right? Because you might have a template that deploys a domain controller, a web server, a SQL server, right? All of this stuff. And your workload is not going to run. Your SQL server is not going to be able to run or even, function correctly unless you add it to the domain, right? So that SQL server, even though it's just VMs, actually depends on the DCs being spun up. And that's what the good thing about these extensions are, is that these extensions will try to configure, and if they configure successfully, they'll report back to the template execution engine and say, hey, I'm done, I've configured correctly. Now that my DCs are there, my SQL boxes, I can be sure that they can be added to the domain, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a logical dependency. It's not necessarily like a physical dependency, because I can in my own data center, right? I could spin up a SQL box and wait until my domain controllers are there to now start adding it to the domain and doing all that stuff, right? I can actually stand up the hardware, right?
Yeah.
In this case, when you're trying to do all this automation and orchestrate things, maybe for disaster recovery, maybe just to spin up an environment quickly, you'll want to make sure that if you have a dependency on having that domain there, then your extension here will not report back that it's correctly done until that machine has configured itself.
Very cool. Good little bits of info to call out, because I feel like Matt has definitely, I think you're battle tested when it comes to DSC, right? You've seen it all. And that's why I've even hit home that, if you get stuck, reach out to Matt. You can reach out to me. I can help you to some point, but eventually I'll have to punt over to Matt or somebody like Matt who can maybe give you a little bit more guidance. But I often feel like Matt's seen quite a bit in this realm. And I think that was the role prior to your current role, right? Where you were with customers building things out, or was that even before that role? We were talking about Microsoft.
I was a PFE, and I was an Azure PFE, so I saw a lot of broken stuff, right? Helped fix a lot, PFEs now called cloud engineers or CEs. They see a lot. They get a lot of times brought into the loop too late, right? They try to be proactive, and it's best for our customers to engage them proactively, so you don't get into a spot where you have a support ticket for something you did that was not necessarily the most intelligent thing, right? But it's because of ignorance. You didn't know. These guys know. They've seen everything that can happen, so engage them before you get a support ticket versus after, because it'll be a lot easier to fix before you have a support ticket. And so that's the role I was in. I saw a lot of broken things, but I've also broken a lot of things, and that's how I learn. I used to say
that's how you learn best, right?
Right. I used to say I put the break in break fix.
So I think the next thing I want to talk about here are the actual settings underneath the properties, right? So we talked about the publisher, talked about the type, talked about the type handler version, talked about the auto upgrade minor version.
Yep.
The settings are the next piece here. And so this is where we're concatenating that URL for the SAS token. The script itself, this is the script. And when you run it in Visual Studio, it does zip it and shoves it in a storage account. So that bit that Matt did prior to running it the last time, Visual Studio does it for you. I call this the replica create 80 replica DC. That's the function. And then these are the configure. This is the last little configuration argument, right? So just the domain to join. Remember how we talked about the protected settings? So everything that's up here is going to be passed in clear text. The domain admin username, the domain admin password, these will be passed as encrypted strings. So I wanted to showcase that because I know we had talked it through, and it's one of those things, all of this sits underneath settings and protected settings within the properties declaration of the DSC extension.
Yes, and there's a difference here than what we than what we implemented as well. Can you scroll up real quick and just take a look at your API version on this resource?
This right here?
Yeah, that looks like the same API version that I used, but look at under your settings, you have the script and then the function. And I think when we did mine, the function, or was it called function or module?
Yeah, it looks like it's configuration function. If I hover over settings, it looks like that's what the API is looking for.
Configuration function, and then the modules URL, which is that I used. And that was different because in my configuration function, you had to pass the script name, whatever .ps1 / the function name that you're using. So this and you'll notice this with a lot of times it's between API version changes, right? It'll tell you these are the expected properties, these are properties that have changed or things like that. But this seems to be the same API, so I'm wondering if there's some cross compatibility stuff that is still in this API that supports both the way that you're doing it and the way that I was doing it.
So interesting story. I had to move this environment recently, and I'm not actually going to deploy it as a result. I'll show you the end state. I'll RDP into one of my domain controllers. I already have a site-to-site VPN established. And so I ran this as is, and it worked. So there must be some backwards compatibility within that API, I would imagine.
That's what I think, because what determines those properties that you have under each of these different areas, like settings and things like that, is the API version, right?
Yeah.
That's where you're specifying what are required properties, what are supported properties, and things like that. So it looks like this might be one of those API versions that supports multiple ways of.
Yeah, which is great. And I feel like it's all a matter of how you learn best. And if you like this flavor, just know that this API version will support it as is. I keep saying I should probably update APIs and test it, but I have not yet had the time. Just like never enough time, right?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why you would do that, why you would update the API and test it, is if you needed to take advantage of some functionality that wasn't there during this API, that you now had something change in your requirements, and now you need to take advantage of that, then you would update it. But until you need some new functionality, I would say you're fine leaving it like it is, because those APIs, that's why we're targeting a specific API version, right?
Gotcha. All right. Well, and then so came out of Matt's mouth. I don't have to worry about it until there's something new that I want to take advantage of down the road, right?
Right.
So I do want to call out one thing here. The IP addresses. So these have to be static. Domain controllers need to be static IPs. And so we did this little bit here. We were able to take the parameters, the IP addresses, and we were able to copy index. And so what this did was it allowed us to pass them in as an array, which is kind of cool. Because I remember I was telling Matt, I'm like, okay, so I get what you're doing. This is going to be super awesome and easy, but I'm creating two VMs. How do I give them both static IP addresses? And that's how you do it. That was kind of cool.
Yep. And so that's one of the great things about parameters and variables as well, is that you can actually have complex objects or arrays being passed in either through parameters or variables. I've done some things where I'll pass in a parameter and then have a variable that looks to see what the value of that parameter is and chooses an index of an object within an array of a variable. It's like, is this a Windows or a Linux machine? And then the variable says, if this is a Windows machine, this is what goes in the configuration down here, right? And then you just make a call to that variable, passing in the parameter for whether it's Windows or Linux, and that fills in the rest of the JSON for you, and then it deploys correctly. You know, whether you're like, maybe you're targeting a domain join extension, for example, that isn't supported by Linux, so you would only pass that in on a Windows machine, right?
Yeah.
And so
Cool.
you know, you can make decisions based on things like that, and then have that that template automatically build out what should be in there, a Windows configuration versus a Linux configuration. And I have a template, like I said before in the last video, I have a really cool generic template that does quite a bit of stuff, and it does use constructs like that to determine, you know, is this a Windows or a Linux machine? How many disks do I need to provide to it, etc. And if I could get that scrubbed, because it does have probably some IP that is not public. It's for a customer, but I could get that scrubbed and at some point maybe show it.
Yeah, I was gonna say we could. So I think we had talked about putting the code you worked on into a GitHub repo. Obviously, this will be linked to in the show notes. I'm not going to move this out of that GitHub repo, but I could link to that even in the README file of whatever GitHub repo we use. And you could place that in there too, because I feel like that's the best way to learn. You know, you get all these examples, you get a lot of things of how can I build this? Okay, so I know this template does X, Y, and Z. This one does A, B, and C. Can I use bits and pieces of both? The answer is yes. So we'll try and give you as much as possible in the hopes that this helps you get a little bit better with coding some of this.
Yeah, because you learn, like you'll just, some of these things you'll take and maybe reuse. Some of these things you'll just learn from. Because
Yeah, stumbling.
yeah, well, to be honest, I learned a lot from one of the guys on our ARM product group, which was Brian Moore. I worked with him on these customer-based templates that I was talking about, and he had done some talk at I don't know if it was Ignite or something like that. And he's like, you know, here's an ARM template to rule them all. And so we basically took those concepts, and he worked with me a little bit on doing this. And he's like, well, here you can have this, and then let me know what questions you have. And so I ping him back and forth and say, hey, you know, this is pretty cool. What about this? I ran into some bugs, and he's like, yeah, that doesn't work that way. We have to do it a different way because of this bug not being supported. Which I never followed up to see if it ever did get supported, but it has to do with passing an array of disks. You can't pass it as a zero-based array, or at least you couldn't pass it as an array of 0. Otherwise, it would fail. But yeah, some cool things like that I learned from him, and then I've taken and used, you know, down the line. So hopefully, you know, I can pass that knowledge on to you guys.
Yeah, very cool. So I'll talk about the DSC configuration next, right? So, you know, the configuration, I call it create 80 replica DC. These are the required parameters, right? And then it's importing the modules. So these are the experimental modules. I need to also at some point try it with the Active Directory DSC modules, because I know that's all sort of newer and usable. So haven't yet done it, not enough time in the day. So just remember that these are using the experimental modules. It does work, and it will work. In fact, I think our quick starts still use the experimental modules for these. So it does work. Just pay attention if you run into problems and you want some supportability. You may have to swap it out. There's an actual Active Directory DSC module that you can import now that it doesn't have an X in front of it. But yeah, so it's the local configuration manager. Let's see, you know, it's adding the RSAT tools.
Oh, That is that local configuration manager was the one that we didn't use that before. But this is where I was talking about. This is what configures the machine
Oh
to
yeah, say
go
that.
and pull for a file, and see if it's changed, and you can set it to do, to pull every half hour or whatever, to see if there's a new configuration available for it, right? So this is configuring the local config manager of that server that's actually running DSC, right? So that's that special local config manager key that you see up there is to say this is how I'm configuring DSC on the local machine.
Yeah, and then this first little bit indicates that if any of the configurations require a reboot, continue the configuration. And so obviously, if you're joining a domain, you're adding a server role, you're going to have to reboot that server.
Yep.
So we added that in first. We're adding in the RSAT tools. We are configuring disk 2 because you do need a, you can't have a cached disk for any of your sysvol info inside of Azure. So you want to make sure that you have a separate data disk for this. The disk gets formatted. Then the server gets joined to the domain. And notice how each one of these are depends on wait for disk, depends on the add data disk. So this does happen serially. Yeah. So, and then this is adding in the Active Directory domain server or Active Directory domain services server role. Then it's configuring the forest. It's passing in the domain name, the domain creds, the safe creds, right? So that you don't have to worry about plugging that in after the fact. This is the database path, the log path, the sysvol path, and it's depending on that as well. And then this is the last reboot, just to make sure that everything is ready to go. So this DSC script, while it's not super long, it's pretty mighty in the sense that it's continuing on the reboot path. It's kind of sort of putting a placeholder in, and it's rebooting, and it's picking up where it left off. It's adding a disk. It's formatting a disk. It is it's creating the Active Directory environment, right? It's joining itself to the domain. What's crazy with this specifically is this domain already exists on-prem, right? So on-prem is my house. I need a life. But anyway, so that domain exists here at my house, and I just plug the DNS in so it knows how to figure itself out. So that's why it's first joining itself to the domain. And this is why it's then adding itself to the domain as a replica domain controller, which is kind of cool. So I think the next piece would probably be talking about what it looks like when it's deployed, right? So let's close out of this. So remember how it's two different disks or two different servers, right? So that's my initials, West US3 DCO1, right? And then there's, keep going down, there's DCO2. Look at how that concatenation for the disk. It's the server kind of prefix, DCO1, OS disk, right? Then there's the data disk. It's kind of cool to see the concatenation in action with the copy index and the pad left. I was kind of blown away with it. Once I understood what I was doing, I was sort of blown away with how it looked.
Are those managed disks?
They are managed disks.
Cool.
Yes, they are managed disks. If they are unmanaged, I forget what they look like. I think the icon changed recently, but you still can create an unmanaged disk. You wouldn't want to, but yeah, these are managed disks. Where does it show?
Yeah, they're.
Is it size and performance?
I thought there was a place that showed, and maybe it's in the JSON actually, that shows managed by. Oh no,
Yeah, managed by. Yeah, so it's a managed disk, which is cool. But yeah, so that's kind of how it looks. And then what I was planning on going through next was kind of RDPing into one of those servers. So let's RDP into it. Now remember, I've got a site-to-site VPN connection. And this, I'm not using a public IP at all, right? Okay.
That strong password.
You have to, right?
Yeah.
So let's walk through a little bit of the configuration. I'll let it launch. I'll let the server roles show up here. Give it a second or two. DNS, Active Directory, right? It's kind of nice to see that. Then you've got F is your data disk. There's your database and logs.
Sysvol, yep.
Sysvol info, which is cool. So everything wound up getting configured the way we expected. And I mean, I can pull up Active Directory, sites and services, users and computers, right? And it's the same domain I've got on-prem, which was super cool to set up. And I think a lot of folks have taken these templates and made them work in their world. But remember, there's Dsc logs on the server itself. So it's guest agent, right? Or is it logs?
Logs, yep.
Logs, okay. So this is, you can tell I recently ran it, right? I ran it.
Scroll back up and go to the plugins folder.
See, oh, sorry, it's down here.
Oh yeah.
I sorted it differently.
Dsc.
So yeah, so it ran at about 6:30 on the 4th of November, right before the 5th of November, right? What is it? Remember the 5th of November. So I got that out of the way before the 5th of November hit. Okay, so PowerShell DSC, right? Yeah, because that's the one that we want to take a look at. This is the handler version.
And sort by date modified.
Yeah. So which one do you want me to pull up, Matt? What would be?
I imagine it'd be one of the ones on the 4th. Sometimes I look for size, like I look at the size and see, because some, yeah, if you use a lot of like, standard ones, and then take one of the larger size.
Do you want me to take the extension handler? Open that one up?
Yeah.
Okay, so you get a lot of good info here, right? So again, if something's not working right,
yep, and you can
look what it's doing, right? It's at that part of the DSC script, right?
Exactly.
DSC configuration completed, resetting meta configuration. So these are really good things to see, but if you are running into problems, clearly these are the spots to go to figure out what's going on.
So can you go into the work folder for this? If you go, it's going to be C plugins, I think. No, go back farther.
Log?
Go to C.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go to, maybe it is Windows Azure. Go in there.
Well, there's the guest agent stuff, and I know we pulled things out of here. Oh, maybe we didn't. No, we didn't.
Oh, I thought it was, I didn't think it was the Windows Azure folder, though. Do we have, I wonder if it's hidden. Can you show hidden?
No, just program data was hidden.
No. So there's
We may have changed some of this around because I do remember there was a separate spot to grab some info at one point. Maybe they made this easier to find.
Try packages. Plugins. There we go.
Ah, there we go.
In here, and then yeah, see the DSC. Oh, there's your manifest right there. Oh no, that's an XML. It should just be. Yeah, try DSC work.
That's the moth files.
Yeah, grab that. Open up that localhost.moth.
Notepad?
Yep, Notepad. All right, let's take a look for where the password is getting plugged in.
Oh, that's a good one. There you go. Look at it. Look at it. You're not going to tell what that password is.
Nope.
So that's the credential one ref, which should be the local. admin password. And then let's see. So join the domain. Here is the credential of my Inception account.
Yep. So that's where it passes it in, all encryptified.
Very cool. And the credential 3. Yeah, it's cool to see some of this stuff behind the scenes, right? If you're just trying to figure out how some of this works. And like I said, I recently redeployed this. So early November, and we're sitting here a little over a month later. But yeah, so I mean, so I guess kind of at this point, we've taken you through. I'm going to flip back to us here. We've taken you through and kind of shown you ARM templates, shown you why infrastructure as code is important. I think what comes next, because we sort of took you through a lot of different levels of getting better at ARM templates, what comes next is the brand new flavor of ARM templates, Bicep templates. And Matt and I, because it's close to the holiday season, we will kind of go away for a couple of months and figure out how we want to structure introducing you to Bicep, getting familiar with Bicep. Maybe we even take the code that we've already built and we put it into Bicep. That would be kind of a fun thing, fun exercise. So Matt and I are going to take some time over the holidays and early next year to come up with ways in which that we can teach this to you so it's easy to understand, so you know where to go. It's not that you can't figure out where to go in our documentation. I think sometimes it's just hard. There's a lot of links. And so sometimes having a Sherpa guide, right, kind of helping you through that process, maybe that'll help you embrace more of the infrastructure as code components. So
yeah, and documentation is good. If you know, like if you're going through something, you know, you kind of have a direction and you're going somewhere and you're like, oh, I'm stuck here. Let me consult the documentation. But documentation is not great when you're starting from scratch and saying, okay, what do I do, right? I don't even know these concepts. I don't know, you know, how do I do multiple machines? Do I have to, you know, if I have a 200 machine deployment, am I putting one of these little JSON entries in for every single machine, or, you know, things like that. So documentation, you could eventually get the gist of it, but it gives you a lot quicker start into where you're going. You have somebody to kind of guide you and say, look, this is where we're going. This is what this is. Follow along. Trust me for a minute, and then you'll understand here in a few minutes when I explain this. And so that's kind of where we're trying to add that value.
Yeah. So yeah, so if you like what you've learned thus far, feel free to like, share, subscribe, all of the above. We'll come back with new content early next year. It'll be DJ Shan Azure Remixed Season 2. We're calling this the end of Season 1, or at least we being me, myself, and I, calling this the end of Season 1. And it's been a really good season of learning quite a bit about ARM templates, troubleshooting and getting around some of the issues as well. I feel like maybe it worked out well to have a handful of those demos that weren't as polished, so we could sort of show in real time how you troubleshoot, how to read through some of the error messages, and then kind of taking you through to DSC at the end. So hopefully you found it invaluable. And with that, Matt, any closing words from you?
No, I mean, you know, I'm a fan of the way that we did things too, so we can kind of gain a little bit of confidence and then lose it when you see me mess up and say,
or me,
guy that's teaching
we both messed up, right?
And then come back and suck you with the confidence boost again, teaching you something like DSC. So it's going to be fun. Makes me wonder, you know, I'm a fan of The Walking Dead. It makes me wonder how many episodes or how many seasons I'm going to survive.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
The good characters always die. I
know, it's true. And they always die when you don't want them to die. You're like, you've been around for 4 seasons. Why now? You know, why didn't you die this first season you were around? So anyway. All right. Well, with that, we're going to sign off. We'll see you next year for Season 2. And if you've got any feedback, any comments, anything of that sort, feel free to let us know. And I'll provide all the right links in the show notes. So with that, we'll see you next year. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.